Hello, everybody, and welcome to our NCSA webinar, which is our virtual book tour with Dr. Amy Lutz, who is the author of this brand new book. It just was published, Chasing the Intact Mind, How the Severely Autistic and Intellectually Disabled Were Excluded from the Debates That Affect Them Most. So welcome, Dr. Lutz.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you for having me.
And as you guys probably know, Amy is the Vice President of National Council on Severe Autism. She is also a senior lecturer at University of Pennsylvania in the History and Sociology of Science. And this is actually her third book. She is a prolific writer, a terrific writer, and she's the mother of Jonah, who is a young man with profound autism. As I said, this session will be recorded and we will upload it. So if you have to leave and you can catch it later. I also invite people to submit questions. Hopefully we'll have a nice long Q&A session. You're welcome to use the chat as well, but it's too discombobulating. So I'll probably stick to Q&A for questions, pop them in anytime, and I'll get to them when I can, but I'm going to start off with a series of questions. But I'll start off by saying that the book is remarkable, and I think it came out right at the right time. I think it was a voice, a message that's absolutely essentially important and urgent at a time when the autism narrative is just spinning out of control away from reality. And this book really it kind of lassos the narrative and tries to bring it back to reality with a couple of very important messages. It's a bit, I will say, it's a bit dense and academic. It's heavily footnoted. There's a ton of sources, that she refers to, but it's still very readable because Amy's just a good writer. What it does essentially is it examines one aspect of this conceptual backdrop against which policy decisions are made, against which program decisions are made, against which funding decisions are made. So this conceptual backdrop is actually very relevant. Some people might think, oh, it's so abstract, intact mind, whatever, but it's actually very relevant to the tangible resources available for our very disabled loved ones. So, Amy, I want to ask you first, what is the intact mind?
Well, the intact mind is the assumption or expectation that there is a typical or even genius intellect deep inside even people who present as being very profoundly autistic. And what struck me about this intact mind narrative, there was so much that I was thinking about as I was working on this project, but one is it's fairly unique to autism. So you don't see people describing their kids with Down syndrome this way or other types of genetic syndromes like Angelman syndrome or Williams syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome. But in autism, it's almost the expectation. So I read about 80 parent memoirs for this project because it was my argument. It's my argument that the intact mind assumption is really amplified through these parent accounts of how they recovered their children's intact mind through a host of different interventions like ABA or diet or riding wild horses in Mongolia or watching Disney movies or whatever. And I totally lost my train of thought here. So
yeah, well, you were talking about how did the idea, what is the intact mind? And
it's amplified in parent memoirs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I read 80, that's right, sorry, thank you. It's been a long couple of weeks, Jill. In the past 10 days, I've presented at 2 conferences, done 3 book events, I've been to Vegas and back. It's been I'm a little kind of altered right now.
Yes, I should say parenthetically, Amy and I just saw each other in person at the Together for Choice conference in Vegas, where we co-presented about discrimination against people with severe autism. But go ahead.
So what I was saying is parents of other types of intellectual disabilities don't describe their children in this way, but it's hugely common in autism parent memoirs. And I should say, even the majority of memoirs the intact mind is accessed. And that makes sense, right? You know, publishers don't want to publish depressing memoirs about kids who remain profoundly disabled, attacking their parents, fecal smearing, all that stuff. But there are some. And some of the most prominent, like Josh Greenfeld's 3 memoirs about his son Noah. But even in the memoirs in which the intact mind is not recovered, the authors still wrestle with that, still expect that, still hope for that, and that theme is still very prevalent. And I thought that was just it, you know, as my training. I wrote this book as my dissertation for my PhD in the history of medicine. And you know, I was just struck by this narrative, the sense that it obviously, as I'm sure every single person on this in this webinar knows, doesn't reflect anything biologically true about autism. So then where did it come from? It had to come from somewhere. So the first half of the book is an analysis of where, in my opinion, you know, how the intact mind emerges largely from psychoanalytic literature of the mid-20th century, and how it gets amplified in these parent memoirs and is still so prevalent today.
I have a question about like why autism, why is this intact mind? And I agree. I think that there's some history behind it. There's the parent memoirs behind it. But I think a lot of it comes from the fact that our kids don't have dysmorphic features for the most part.
Yeah.
So when you see somebody with an IDD, at least sort of old school IDD, they would generally have some sort of facial or physical dysmorphia that would give you a hint that they had intellectual disability. When you look at kids like Jonah, or you look at the kids like mine, like Johnny or Sophie, they look completely normal. They have no dysmorphology. And so it sort of beggars belief to believe that somebody who developed normally and they don't have genetic defects would have such severe cognitive impairment. I think there's some dissonance for people, especially in autism, because of that. And that's more of a comment than a question.
No, but to respond, first of all, it's almost the kind of the cliche is that autistic kids are even more beautiful than, you know, neurotypical kids. That comes up a lot in these parent memoirs. And I know our kids are, of course, evidence of that. And but also I think what plays into that is the fact that we as parents think of our kids as typical or genius for the first couple years until
Right.
the signs of autism present. So it's even harder to dislodge that idea, because the kid that we thought we knew, that we thought we had, it turns out not to be that kid. And then of course there's the fact that a lot of autistic kids have splinter skills. So for us, even when we knew that Jonah was autistic, by the time he was 2.5, he was hyperlexic as a child. So he was reading and writing before he could talk, and we didn't teach him. So we just found out because he started writing in chalk on the driveway, which seemed amazing to us. So we thought for sure that even if he was autistic, he was, you know, going to be one of those genius autistics, you know, that, you know, was just going to be socially clueless, but incredibly academically accomplished.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do think there's that, but also, at least in the 90s, you know, there was so much, I would say, false hope peddled about ABA and its ability to normalize your child. And so I think people really, you know, took on this, like, well, God, if I give them enough intervention and enough ABA, that, you know, the true Johnny will come out, you know, because it's so mystifying. And you read things like, let me hear your voice. Well, look what happened. Her kid's, you know, transformed. Won't that happen to my kid? Well, there's not really a lot of evidence that does happen. Although some people do exit the spectrum, but let's move on. I see a lot of questions coming in and we will get to them. I do want to say that I did appreciate that, you know, the parent memoirs, or also some realistic memoirs, you know, the feces on the wall, the plaster being eaten, the duct taping the door so the kid couldn't open it and leap out onto the freeway, you know, taking a bite out of a camp counselor's arm. I mean, I can relate to many of these things, and yeah, not all parent memoirs are rosy and intact mind oriented at all. And I appreciated that. But I want to move on because the book is predominantly these case studies where you look at three areas where the idea, the concept of the intact mind actually has real life repercussions. The first area, and I won't tell you what they are yet. Sorry, readers. But there's so many areas, right, where this has a detrimental impact. Tell me, why did you choose these three particular case studies as opposed to like other things like housing?
Okay, well, I'm just like kind of scrolling through the attendees, making sure there's no one from my department here before I confess that, of course, even though I am a historian of medicine, my main interest was in how this intact mind assumption undergirds so much policy and practice affecting our kids today. So the case studies are the second half of the book, but that was really, that's my intervention. That's what I want kind of policymakers to read, to understand. If they don't understand how we got here, if they don't care, I don't really care if they care, but just I really want them to see how, even though we don't make it explicit, this assumption that even people who are profoundly autistic have this intact mind and should have the same types of supports and services as anybody else, as any neurotypical person or person with physical disabilities or something like that, that is really harming our kids. So the way I chose these case studies, well, first of all, you asked about housing. You know that's a passion of mine. And the way Jill and I connected was my first major project of my writing project in the kind of adult services space was over residential settings. I wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2015 called, where they called it something like, "Where Should Autistic Adults Live?" And it was examining this, this anti-congregate bias. I mean, in Pennsylvania, you're not allowed to build anything larger than 4 people, any residential setting larger than 4 people for people with an intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I thought that was unbelievable for so many reasons, but I don't want to get sidetracked on that. But the point is, I had written a lot about that. So I was like, I should pick something different because I don't want to just rehash something I've already litigated a lot in the public sphere. I knew I wanted to write about facilitated communication because it was just resurging as I started working on this project. And, I've been following the facilitated communication story since the 1990s. And I couldn't believe that despite all the evidence showing that the facilitator was controlling the output, not the intellectually disabled user, that it was still, I mean, it's maybe roaring back even bigger than it was during the first iteration. So I knew I wanted to tackle that. And I chose to also write about the fight to eliminate 14C, the subminimum wage. And I picked that one because I think that case study is maybe the best example of how disconnected the discourse around an issue is compared to the reality on the ground. So I don't know if you want me to go into this now or if you want me to kind of.
Okay, well, and did you mention the third one?
And the third one is about the erosion of guardianship. And I knew I wanted to write about that because going back a couple of years now, I was talking to Lisa Parles, who is on our board at NCSA, and she was at an event probably like 4 or 5 years ago that the United Nations was hosting for World Autism Awareness Day on like April 1st or 2nd. And she texted me, she's like, "You would not believe this. The chair of the Disability Committee of the United Nations just compared guardianship to genital mutilation." And I was like, oh, I thought Lisa was being a little hyperbolic, actually. I was like, surely she's exaggerating. And so I actually made the effort to go and find the recording online and watch it. And sure enough, she was right. Not only did Teresa Dejanay, this chair of the Committee on Disability, compare guardianship to genital mutilation, she also compared it to slavery because it was so gross a violation of human rights because everybody can make their own decisions. We all know that,
Right,
so
of course.
I came home and I was like, "Jonah, congratulations. I guess you have capacity now because the United Nations says so." And I just thought that was such an unbelievable, it was such a slap in the face to our families, like as if your kid has capacity, and if you don't think so, this is on you. Like you're just underestimating them. You're not allowing them to be independent and express their autonomy, when all we're trying to do is maximize their agency and give them as much control over their lives as possible, but knowing that's always going to be not that much. So I chose guardianship as well.
Right. And there's so many other areas that this touches,
Yeah.
right? We talked about, this, housing, education, and inclusion-based education, which is sometimes a very good thing, but can also be sometimes a very bad thing when you're presuming too much of a child. And we're supposed to, quote unquote, presume competence. I'm like, if I presume competence in my children, they would be dead.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't presume. I have to presume what I see, and I have to see with my own eyes and the evidence, while always hoping, right, for improvements in their functioning. Right? It's not like, oh, my children are incompetent. I don't care. We want more, but why presume competence when there's no evidence for it? I don't understand how people leap so quickly to some slogan that is not based in reality, but it feels good.
Well, I think it's important to note that the presumed competence slogan comes out of the facilitated communication literature as a way of kind of helping to solidify that. But also, I think the best response is, and I'm always quoting this article by Jason Travers and Kevin Ayers, who wrote they're special education researchers, and they wrote basically a response to this, which their argument is that the opposite of presumed competence is not presumed incompetence. It's don't presume. We should be making our decisions about programming for people with disabilities, and also honestly, for kids who are not disabled, based on ample empirical evidence about their functioning, their skills, their needs, and all that. Like we need to be, we need to make data-driven and informed decisions. We shouldn't be presuming at all.
Yeah, no, that should be obvious, one would think. And another area, before we go into these 3 case studies, is, language, right? We've seen a lot of attack on language, particularly on language that reflects the more severe and profound side of autism.
Yeah.
Of course, Amy and I are unfortunately very familiar with this phenomenon. And part of that, attack on the language and trying to language police and trying to really limit the words that people consider negative about autism is because autism can only be framed, right, as a difference rather than as a disorder, according to these advocates. Of course, that's crazy. Few people in the world are as disabled as our children. So of course they're disabled. Of course they have a mental disorder. It's obvious to anybody, with half a brain. But nevertheless, they don't like the idea. They're uncomfortable with the idea of the impaired mind.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to your, there's so many things. You could have written a much longer book. You could have had 10 case studies, but you did 3. So let's start off with 14C, the sub minimum wage. So, we hear, and I hear this all the time from disability rights groups, everyone will succeed if given the chance.
Yeah.
I got something from a leading autism society about the limitless possibilities for our children. I'm like, few people on the planet have more limited possibilities than my children. Why are you saying these platitudes that are totally meaningless? But do they really believe this? I mean, Amy, does anyone really believe that Jonah and Johnny are going to go out and get competitive integrated employment jobs? I can't believe anyone can believe that.
Well, here's what I'll say is that this is not just disability rights activists who are making this claim, but this is built into a lot of government policy on 14C. So the core assumption of employment first, which comes out of the Department of Labor and is a kind of a framework that I think about 38 states have embraced as a priority for their disability service provision systems, is that everybody, no matter how disabled, can hold competitive minimum wage work. And I can only assume that the people who are the staunchest champions of this have just actually never met anyone like Jonah or Johnny, because it seems self-evident that there are people whose not just profound cognitive impairments, because you can say, well, I actually think that it's not Jonah's cognitive impairments that preclude him doing some kind of basic labor, but more like their behavioral challenges, very significant behavioral challenges, inability to kind of sit still, or, there's just so many impediments to competitive minimum wage work. But I do think the bigger problem with the 14C discourse is because you can say one, we can put aside their capabilities, but you shouldn't exploit disabled people. To me, that's the narrative that comes out the strongest from the 14C debate. The idea that there are these capitalists, these evil Monty Burns type capitalists from The Simpsons who are getting rich off the backs of, these impoverished, exploited, disabled workers, right? And so to me, that is and that's what gets everybody into such a tizzy about 14C, this idea of exploiting vulnerable people, when in fact, as this may not be true in every case, but according to from my research, it seems clear that virtually no one is intended to survive on the wages that they make from a 14C program. And actually, because the participants in 14C are significantly disabled, they are actually the recipients of pretty large budgets from the state to support them that go well into the six figures, that pay for residential services, that pay for transportation, that pay for whatever types of therapy they need, all of these things. So
and the on-site support at the work program,
paying for the 14C program itself as kind of like a day, as something to give their days some meaning and structure.
14C is more of a service than
exactly. It's more of a service.
It's a service.
Yes. Yeah. And so because people are not living on this money and they're actually getting their lives are being financed in a totally different way, and these things are all connected, that's why there is no exploitation that is happening here. You could just call it something else. You could call it a service, but a lot of the people who do work there, and I should say there are very few, I met one, but I think there are very few profoundly autistic kids like ours in 14C programs because the staffing ratio isn't thick enough, because of the aggressive and self-injurious and other disruptive behaviors. So these are even like kind of higher functioning in people than our kids. And some of them really do like getting the paycheck. It doesn't matter to them how much. They're just using it to go, buy some kind of thing they collect, or go to the movies, or go out for dinner, or buy presents for their family, or something small. But the fact is their basic needs are being provided in other ways. So there's no exploitation happening here.
The worst thing about it seems to me, and like, frankly, to be honest, like, I don't care that much about 14C one way or another, so long as there are ways for people to engage, right, in productive, safe, engaging, skill building activity. Like, call it 14C, call it whatever you want. But what bothers me is that there seems to be this zeal to shutter 14C with no discussion about what are the alternatives, right?
Well, that's because they assume and they argue that everyone's going to go get a competitive minimum wage job.
But there's no evidence for that.
Exactly. In fact, the limited evidence, it's shocking that there's not more evidence, because I think 16 states have gotten rid of their 14C programs already, and Vermont did it like 20 years ago. So you would expect there to be robust data about what happens to these former 14C participants. There's only a little, which kind of suggests that they don't really want to know what happens. But the kind of sparse data that is available shows that actually very few former 14C participants end up migrating into competitive labor, and most people end up either stuck at home or moving into like some kind of a day program, like a non-compensated day program.
I think you cited that in Washington State, only 17% moved into competitive jobs.
Yeah.
And sometimes when they get those competitive jobs, I know because I've talked to some of these families that might work 8 hours a week,
exactly.
10 hours a week, 12 hours a week. It's nothing like what they used to have. So
I just want to, so one of the statistics from Maine was that they got rid of their 14C programs, and the people with intellectual and developmental disabilities work the fewest hours of any, state in the country, because you can replace, if someone needs a job coach who's being paid like $40 an hour or something, you can maybe do that for a couple hours a week, but you can't do that
Right.
for the whole like 30 hours a week that the person was occupied before in the 14C program.
Very good. Well, let's move on to the second case study, which is guardianship. Kind of underneath the attacks on guardianship and this ascendance of supported decision making, and I say ascendance because people aren't really using it from what I can tell. It's only an ascendance in on paper. Is this idea that everyone's capable of making their own decisions on important matters, no matter how cognitively impaired they are, right?
Yeah.
Of course, this is absurd. I mean, my children can't, they might be able to choose if they want rice or pasta, but beyond that, or if my daughter wants to hear that song or this song, beyond
Yeah.
that, she has no concept. I mean, her cognitive abilities are at a toddler level, and same with my son. So even when it's absolutely observably false,
Yeah.
right, we see disability advocates who want to do away with guardianship because autonomy, as you said, is a central plank of the disability rights movement. Autonomy for my kids is death, right?
Yeah.
Autonomy for Jonah is death, right? That's not a good thing. So tell me about the rise of supported decision making in the complete absence of research to suggest that it's actually a viable and safe alternative.
Well, I think there are a few things. One is what you said, that disability rights is kind of founded on this drive for autonomy, because the disability rights movement was founded by people with physical and sensory disabilities who did in fact have intact minds, and they were
Right.
really resented not having the opportunities that non-disabled people had, just because you're a post-polio quadriplegic like Ed Roberts, who was trying to get into Berkeley
Right.
in the late 1960s, didn't mean that you couldn't do it, and he did do it. So you can see why autonomy was so cherished by disability rights advocates, and they just kind of extend this to everybody. I think other factors include that their significant abuses have happened under guardianship, so people have become very wary about guardianship. But I will say one thing that surprised me, and I write about this in the book, was that, the 14C, a lot of people think it's gone. It's going to be over. We just heard last week the Department of Labor announced they're doing a systematic review of 14C, which to a lot of us is kind of like, is this the death knell of 14C at the federal level? It certainly seems to be that way. But in guardianship, no matter that we're seeing similar types of kind of rhetoric around it, what I found when I talked to families was that the families of profoundly autistic children were still getting guardianship. That when it came to the moment where the rubber met the road,
Right.
and the judge was there in a room with a profoundly autistic 18-year-old and their family, and about this much paperwork demonstrating the significant intellectual disability, the lack of safety awareness, the need for around-the-clock supervision. There were no judges. No one told me about judges who said, I think, your kid has competency because the United Nations, we know, says that they do. No judge wants to be responsible for what could happen, under those circumstances. So the families, even if they had to jump through a lot of onerous red tape that the states were putting
And you describe a mom in Tennessee
yeah.
that really had to jump through crazy hoops.
Yeah, it was incredible. But but in that moment, the actual hearing was pretty blah. The judge was like, yeah, okay, obviously your child needs guardianship. So I'm hopeful that even if, these neurodiversity activists are kind of, talking all about ending guardianship, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has come out against guardianship. But I think that the practicalities of it will mean it will always be here, and that judges will always, in that moment when the evidence is provided, which is fair, right? We don't want to put people under guardianship who don't need it. But with our kids, it's not like there's some kind of gray area, like, well, maybe Jonah can make his decisions for himself. I mean, he can. He has no abstract concept. Someone like that can't, make any decisions for himself that have any consequence.
I mean, I agree with you in that, I'm in California, right? And I would say everybody that I know who has a very significantly impacted child has been able to get guardianship through our court system.
Yeah.
Like when I took Johnny in for guardianship, the judge basically took one look at the papers, one look at him, and was like, okay, I don't think I have any questions. I mean, it was
Yeah.
so obvious, right? My Johnny, I think he was like chewing on the bench,
Yeah.
something like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I go in with Sophie actually next year, so that'll be fun. But what concerns me isn't so much the judges, because I think they have their heads screwed on. It's that, for example, in California, we see a conservatorship, which is our guardianship system called conservatorship. Our conservatorship system is completely overwhelmed. A lot of it has to do with the deluge of autism cases. It's completely overwhelmed. It's harder to get court dates. It's harder if you have to get, add somebody to the conservatorship. If you have some complexity, it's just harder. And it's, they don't keep good records. It's sort of a mess. And we also don't have great supervision over guardianships. I'm a big believer that guardianship is a judicially supervised process, and it should be. People like me, we should be held accountable, right? We have to be good guardians for our charges. And that doesn't happen because it's overwhelmed. But instead of focusing on that, what we've done in California is we're moving into, we have to, people have to try supported decision making, first. But okay, I don't, we can spend an hour on supported decision making, but supported decision making is this idea that somebody with an intellectual disability can kind of choose their own advisors, and that they can go to advisors and then make their own decisions, like without anybody who has an actual fiduciary duty, without anybody who's judicially supervised, in that role, in that legally protective role. And you see, the resources moving in that direction. It's absurd. So the people who really need the support, are being ignored.
Yeah, I mean, there have been critics of guardianship for decades. I think maybe around the time JFK came to presidency, and brought a lot more awareness about issues relating to kind of intellectual disability because of his own personal connection to this cause. His was probably the first administration to look at partial guardianships, saying maybe people don't need to have, lose full control over their lives. Maybe they just need help in particular areas. But even as all these kind of criticisms of guardianship were accumulating and documentation of certain excesses or abuses, the argument was typically, we need better supervision, we need more supervision, not we need less supervision. It seems likely to result in more abuses under the system, more abuses when there's no accountability, and you have.
That's it. Zero accountability for people who are very vulnerable and clearly mentally impaired. And I think it's highly irresponsible. And I won't get into it that much because we have so many questions and I want to move on. All right. So finally, drum roll, please. Your third case study is on, as you said, facilitated communication. And, it's definitely having a resurgence now as spelling to communicate and as RPM. Amy and I were talking before we started the webinar because we both know people with pretty substantial autism who do type independently, and nobody here is doubting that a lot of our people can communicate through typing, without assistance, and that sometimes they actually have more going on in their heads than you would presume. I definitely believe that. I see a lot of talent and intelligence, coming from some of my autistic friends that I just wouldn't have guessed. But there is this other phenomenon, I think, beyond that with facilitated communication, which involves an intermediary to produce text, to produce speech. So, Amy, can you describe what you mean by facilitated communication?
Yeah, so facilitated communication involves communication that happens with the help of a communication partner or facilitator that's providing physical support in some way. So the kind of facilitated communication 1.0 that was kind of brought over from Australia by Douglas Bicklin from Syracuse University in 1989, that was a lot more direct physical support at the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder. Today's iterants of facilitated communication, RPM, the rapid prompting method, and spelling to communicate, typically don't use that type of direct physical touch, but a person is holding the letterboard. And importantly, that communication cannot occur if that letterboard is fixed on a stand or a table. I should also add that there are some cases where people go on to communicate, to type on a letterboard that is fixed, but only in the presence of certain certain aides, certain people, and they can't do it across all circumstances. And I should say there's extensive documentation that cueing, subconscious cueing, can happen in the absence of touch through all kinds of signals that we give off unconsciously, from the way we breathe to, just how we shift our weight. There's all kinds of ways in which cueing can occur. So the only way to know whether independent communication is happening is if testing is done under controlled conditions. And what I mean by that is doesn't have to be in a lab. It doesn't have to be super fancy, expensive, or invasive. It just means a person who is being facilitated or spelling using a letterboard in this way needs to be able to produce information that is unknown to the facilitator. That's the control. And if a person can do that, then it's independent communication. But I should also say that has never been documented in more than 30 years of looking at these interventions.
Yeah, and I think that you and I probably have some disagreement about the subtle cueing, because yeah, I've seen people type and point fairly complex thoughts, independently, and I can't imagine that shifting and looking and gazing can produce that complexity of thoughts in those people. Now, they were not this. Like, I've seen a lot of absolutely 100% fraudulent FC that's so obvious you can't believe anybody would pay a cent for it. But this wasn't that. I've seen people type who, if the cueing was there, it's so subtle it didn't seem possible to produce.
I know. Well, here's the thing: you really can't trust your eyes, and that's why you need to build this testing. Absolutely. I mean, the classic example that comes up in these conversations about the subtlety of cueing. This is not at all to compare disabled people to animals, but just to say that cueing can happen so subtly that you can't really see it just by the kind of the untrained eye, which is Clever Hans, a very famous horse in Berlin in 1904, who had the whole city captivated because he was answering questions by tapping out his hoofs, math problems. He was answering all kinds of questions this way. And they brought in a whole team of experts, including a veterinarian, some psychologists from the university, multiple people, to just assess this phenomenon. And nobody could see any evidence of cueing. I mean, they didn't believe that the horse was really communicating, but they couldn't see how it was being done until finally a psychology grad student came in and did a very thorough, minute investigation and found out that the trainer was inadvertently cueing the horse when to stop tapping his hoof just by kind of dropping his head a little bit. Now, I know this isn't going to what you're talking about with really advanced typing, but all I'll say is, I hope it's true. I really hope that there are people who are finally having their intact minds accessed, through this way. But I will say it's never, once you subject the methodology to controlled experiments, not once has it ever held up, even though the James Randi Foundation famously offered $1 million prize to anybody who could do it. Nobody ever claimed that prize. So here's what I'll say. I don't know if there's anybody using FC or FC of any kind on this webinar, but I've said it before. I will be the first person to write the celebratory piece, celebratory article about a person who is able to demonstrate independent communication through a letterboard under controlled conditions. I think that's great. And I hope that if you believe that your child is communicating independently, that you do participate in these tests, because it's the only way that we'll figure out, which people may be more likely to benefit from this intervention. Right now you have the people who run, you have Soma, you have Elizabeth Vossler, the people who run RPM and S2C making these outrageous claims that everybody has this intact mind.
Lunacy, right?
So, I mean, even if it works for some people, we kind of need to know who are the people that it works for, and how can we
Right.
identify those people early? And the only way that's going to happen is if these communities participate in, partner with universities and participate in controlled experiments. And I have to say, one of the most enormous red flags is the absolute refusal to participate in controlled testing by both of these communities. I mean, that's just not how the scientific process works. You don't get to assert truths and not subject it to kind of rigorous testing.
My feeling is, autism is obviously vastly heterogeneous. There's so many different brains within autism, under the umbrella of autism. My hunch is that there is some population that can, actually use these methods to achieve independent communication. I don't know if that population is 0.5% or if it's 5%. It's not going to be very big, believe me, because I know gajillion people with autism, and I can't imagine that there are intact minds in the vast majority. But that's what I think. I think that maybe we paint autism with such a broad brush. I saw this one woman independently typing who has autism, but like she's nothing like my daughter who's nonverbal autistic. Right, her characteristics are completely different. So maybe there's something else going on. I don't know, I remain a little bit open, but I think most of it is just total, BS. Anyway, but I feel like I do want to get to the Q&A. One thing that was really clear in your facilitated communication case study is the real contempt people have for the idea of intellectual disability.
Yeah.
Right. The real like nothing could be worse than having a child, right, who has an IQ of 37, right, like Sophie has. Like nothing can be worse than having an impaired mind, right? And so it's this disgust, right, for cognitive impairment. I think that's behind a lot of this need to find the intact mind. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're not allowed. Okay, well, I know I'm among friends here and hopefully like fellow travelers on the profound autism highway, but you're just not allowed to say today that it's worse to have a disability, even if it's profound intellectual disability, even if no one would choose this life for themselves or for their kids. Because when it comes right down to it, everything we value as like what makes our lives meaningful, meaning, just a really interesting and exciting work, or a reciprocal romantic relationship, really kind of thinking about interesting ideas around politics, history, philosophy, literature, all of that stuff is precluded from our kids. And I can't even imagine what Jonah's interior life is like without any abstract knowledge. I mean, I think he's happy most of the time, and that's good, but it's extraordinarily limited, and no one wants that for their kids. So of course, they're going to cling to any shred of hope that that's not the case, that those doors aren't shut to their kids. I mean, I was like that at the beginning. I think everybody is when our kids are younger, and it's, we're hopeful that before it becomes obvious, the developmental trajectory becomes obvious, you have a lot of hope. And, people kind of come to terms with the reality at different times, and I totally respect that. But yeah, I mean, my argument in the book is that actually the intact mind assumption, like, recapitulates these older kind of very stigmatizing arguments, that attach the human value to intelligence. It's not the parents who are like you and me who are out here saying my kid is profoundly intellectually disabled and that's that. We're not the ableist ones. It's the people who kind of insist that the value comes from the ability to write poetry and as well as the privileging of the voices of the most able in these kind of disability policy discussions. Like, how ableist is it to say only people who are intelligent, articulate enough to say what kind of disability services are acceptable, they are the only ones who get a voice in this matter. Like, I can't imagine anything more ableist than that.
It seems like the greatest disrespect, right, to our children to say, well, you only have value if your brain functions like a typical person. And that's basically what the whole movement is based on. And you're right, it's the reverse. The ableists are those
Yeah.
that refuse to accept the reality of our children. Okay, so there are something like 5 billion. I actually have more questions. I'm going to skip them because we have 5 billion questions.
All right.
Gosh, I hardly know where to start, but I'm going to start at the top. Nicole Corrado, who submitted quite a few questions. She's an autistic self-advocate. She said we should accept that people have different kinds of minds, and that some people have intellectual disabilities, and accepting that is okay. And that's what neurodiversity is about. I just want to say, quickly, neurodiversity, our kids are not neurodiverse. Our kids have mental disorders. Our kids have mental impairments, mental and functional impairments. Do we accept them? Of course we accept our kids. Do we think that those things should be prevented and treated when possible? Well, I'm speaking for myself, absolutely 100%. It's not, when I look at my kids, I'm not like, oh, you're neurodiverse and it's just great. I look at them and I think you are very mentally impaired. I love you very much, but I wish it were otherwise. So I think that the vast majority of the world thinks that way, Nicole, and I'm sorry to not agree with you about neurodiversity. I don't know if you want to say something about that, Amy, before I move on.
I just agree with you, Jill. Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Wexler, how do you balance the idea of chasing the intact mind with the idea that they still can make some gains in functioning that are frequently impossible for others to recognize or know how to support?
Well, what I'll say is, of course, you don't have to have an intact mind. You can have an impaired mind and still learn and grow like any other human. So, I mean, I'm still, Joan is 24 and I still, I'm always, we're always trying to teach him some new skill. And I'm hopeful that there, in the future, there could be even more improvements. And it's funny, I was talking to somebody who was like, yeah, I think this might have been at Jonah Zimmerle's event at Words Bookstore. We were talking about how, yes, we don't really believe in the intact mind, but if there's some new intervention that came, we would definitely try it if it had the research, if the evidence showed that could be big improvements. And I was saying how I was very intrigued by the anecdotes around fecal transplants for a while. Like that sounded like maybe some people were having real benefits. So it's not like I've given up the hope that Joan is gonna either have even maybe substantial benefits at some point as our scientific understanding of autism improves, or even just little day-to-day improvements. The day he learned to swallow pills without, me having to smash them up and put them in a peanut butter sandwich, or the huge day when he learned to hand us his iPad when the battery died, instead of like chucking out the window of his moving vehicles, which happened multiple times, that was like a huge learning moment, and so I believe in growth for all of us. I tell my kids all the time, my neurotypical kids, I consider myself a work in progress still. I hope I never stop learning and growing, and I hope none of them do. So I think that's very compatible with the impaired mind. I don't think you have to assume some kind of typical or genius mind in there to hope and work towards real growth.
Mr. Jones asked, since you used this work as part of your PhD dissertation, was there any pushback from your graduate committee?
Yeah, no, I mean, my graduate committee was incredible. I think part of it was, I was definitely an atypical grad student because I think I started grad school when I was 47. I was way older than even a lot of the professors in my department, but I'd already written 2 books. And I don't know how familiar you are with how things are done in the humanities, but typically you spend years working on a dissertation, so then you could spend more years turning it into a book. And I told my committee, I don't have that kind of time. And I also said, I don't even know how to write a dissertation, but I do know how to write a book. So can I just write the book that I want to write? And they were like, yeah, go for it. So I think I'm the only person in my department's history who had a published book a year after the dissertation was defended, because that's just not the typical trajectory. But I had a lot of support, and they gave me a lot of freedom to write a very atypical dissertation because I came in with a very clear vision of what I wanted to do, and they knew that that I could do it. I didn't need as much support as maybe another younger grad student might.
He also asks, has there been any pushback from the self-advocacy autistic movement?
Well, I've been getting pushback from them for 20 years. Nothing about this book in particular yet, except for I have gotten a fair amount of pushback from FC advocates. So like when I published my first book, which was about ECT and autism, I really expected to be slammed because here I was advocating, shocking the brain of my autistic 11-year-old. And I didn't. Most people, the evidence base for ECT is really very robust. And even though there were some people who talked about like brain damage and torture, other people would jump in all the time and comments to things I wrote and just correct them. So I didn't get that kind of pushback. But now, I mean, the FC people really have been coming after me to some degree, people threatening to sue me. When I present at a conference, once my slides were actually circulated outside of the conference to other FC advocates, which kind of gave me like a gaslighting moment where somebody reached out to me about it. And I was like, how do they even know? Like, did I actually present about this before? I couldn't even remember or think about why this person would know what my slides looked like. So I'm kind of expecting that to continue. But it's a little early to say. The book just came out last week, so I've had only, positive feedback from it so far. So
good. Ms. Smith says, do you feel like the HCBS waiver, which is of course a Medicaid program, the home and community-based waiver program, contribute to discrimination in the high acuity care because the state minimizes the caregiver by calling them natural supports? I'm a caregiver, not a superhero. I believe I experienced ableism due to our family never fitting the HCBS groups or the boxes.
Well, I think part of it is depends on how the way HCBS is kind of interpreted by the different states. So to look at like, say, the final rule on settings is pretty good, right? I mean, they revised the guidance, they retracted the guidance about that kind of called out certain settings like farmsteads and campuses as being presumed institutional. And now, the CMS has been really clear and explicit.
CMS, Center for Medicaid, Medicare and Medicaid Services.
That there's nothing necessarily that larger settings are not de facto excluded from the final rule, but in Pennsylvania they've chosen to be more restrictive than required by the federal government, so those things are not allowed in my state. The fact that there's the goal, we also in our state, they really like to think about how they can support parents to keep their disabled kids at home as long as possible. This is the kind of natural support thing. I don't know that that's inherent to HCBS, more like to kind of, states that don't want to spend a lot of money. And this kind of the profound underfunding of the disability kind of service sector. So I don't know that changing
it's partly financial, but I think in HCBS there is, as our statement is, there's systemic discrimination against people with severe and profound autism in HCBS. That's obvious, right? Because the things that they try to eliminate and push back on are only the things that are needed by our population.
Yes. I'm just saying different states do it different ways. So it was kind of interesting, like at the Together for Joyce conference that Jill and I were just at, it was very interesting because someone from Pennsylvania presented about and talked about how in Pennsylvania, the wait list was like 20,000 people. And someone from Texas stood up and said, man, we would kill for the wait list you have in Pennsylvania. Our wait list is like 200,000 for HCBS. And I was thinking, well, I would kill for the ability to kind of build intentional communities like you have in Texas with 29 acres, with Brookwood, with, just these kind of really interesting residential models. There's just less control there, about fewer restrictions. So I think part of it really depends on where you live. But of course, it's all over. The kind of acute intensive disability specific settings are under attack. And I think that is a larger, like you said, Jill, more systemic problem than just HCBS.
Terrible problem. Okay, let's move on because we only have 54 questions.
Okay.
It's okay. Here's a comment, not really a question, from Lori. Also, the biomedical community stating that all you needed to do was get the mercury or toxins out of the system from vaccines, and then they would be normal. So that was sort of another, it's true, that's another facet of intact mind thinking. Many friends have gone down the spell to communicate rabbit hole and claim life-changing results. I want to presume competence, but the profound thoughts that supposedly emanate from their spelling makes me skeptical. My ASD son, who is mid-spectrum verbal kid with ID, does not express himself in that way. They also tend to be anti-vaxxers. What should we make of this?
Well, you've heard, the problem with FC, with any kinds of FC, there is this, sudden literacy where it seems like what you're describing, where people who, kids or young adults who have had no kind of typical education are suddenly displaying age level or above appropriate understanding of different subjects in school, who have never written anything now have perfect grammar, syntax, spelling. It's, yes, it kind of defies common sense, and that's why the testing is required. As far as the overlap with anti-vaxxers, there's definitely some of that. I mean, we have J.B. Hanley, who started Generation Rescue, big anti-vaxxer, now has kind of abandoned that effort and is super into the S2C. He's the one who wrote the book. I think it's called Underestimated, that this movie Spellers you might have seen, this documentary floating around. He's the person behind that. So that's obviously kind of an overlap, but I don't think that you have to be an anti-vaxxer to be kind of sucked into the FC world.
Employment, okay, it says Tom. Employment First came about as a reaction to the DOJ suing Virginia, Oregon, and especially Rhode Island for 10 years. While that's a good goal, not to get sued by the DOJ, it is not a coherent philosophy. Yeah, Employment First has sort of taken over everything because, of course, who wouldn't want employment first?
Because it sounds great. Yeah.
Sounds great. Anonymous says, in our state, it is very difficult to access vocational rehab and employment supports if the client has behavioral needs. Yep. Yeah. They are excluded from employment supports, and the state highlights people mainly with physical disabilities, yep, who have found successful employment. Is this happening in other states?
Yes. Of course, like in this so one of the really interesting document, if you're interested in the 14C issue at all, in 2020, the United States Commission on Civil Rights convened and decided to consider this issue, and they wrote a whole report about it, and they invited some people to testify. By the way, well, I'll just tell you that one of the people they highlight in this report is this blind attorney who apparently was in a 14C setting at some point, making $250 an hour. Now he makes $200,000 a year. And I mean, I guess there are people who have physical or sensory disabilities in 14C programs. I think about 85% or more are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I think we should, of course, work to get the blind attorneys out of 14C programs, but that doesn't mean that the overwhelming percentage of intellectually and developmentally disabled people have the same kind of outcome. But what's even more striking about that report is that as part of the process, they collected, they opened to public comment, and they got more comments on 14C than they did about any other topic they'd ever considered. And 98% of them were in favor of preserving 14C, almost all of them. And the commission still recommended to eliminate anyway, because they privileged the testimony of someone like this blind attorney over the families who were actually, super happy and really grateful to have that support.
It's absolutely like a willful denial of reality. It's a willful denial of reality. I can't get my head around it. Okay, next. When it comes to autistic self-advocates who make specious arguments such as all behavior is advocacy, I wonder if the cognitive dissonance lies with them, meaning they are ashamed to be associated on the same spectrum as my profoundly disabled son. They seem to need to believe there's no cognitive limitation for anyone on the spectrum because they are terrified of the truth about how autism can and does manifest. Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. When there used to be Asperger as a diagnosis, you would definitely hear people saying, I have Asperger. I don't want to get rid of this diagnosis because I don't want to be in the same bucket as the people who are severe. But now what you find is neurodiversity activists actively fighting to prevent the spectrum from being split up again. So I don't understand it. I would totally think it would be more, they would be the first ones to support it, saying, I'm not like that person, that intellectually disabled person who's smacking his head and fecal smearing and all that. Like, that's totally different. So let's call that something else. And we'll have autism as an identity over here. But as Jill, as the neurodiversity community is very much against this profound autism, against splitting up the spectrum. They believe that functioning is fluid, and sometimes even super high functioning seeming people lose their language or a need to stim or whatever, and they think that's all the same. So I don't actually quite know what to make of that.
Next question. I recently watched a friend use FC with her child holding the letterboard. When she was holding the letterboard. When I asked if I could hold the board, she said no, because her son required a, quote, trusting person. Why would legitimate communication depend on trust in this manner? Also, if our kids truly want to communicate via FC, why, whenever a child is angry, do they never seem to initiate the typing? I've never seen a frustrated child reach for the board, but I've seen many break them. I've been there. Or is this phenomenon more than anger impulses overriding the ability and desire to type?
No, you're just pointing out some of the common sense problems with FC, so that's one of the reasons why a lot of FC proponents say they can't, or the kids spell out that they won't participate in testing because they can't actually do it if they're in the presence of a skeptical person or a skeptical researcher. I mean, yeah, this doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, when you think about, imagine if you were trapped in your body for 15 years or 20 years and you finally had access to communicate. Do you really think you'd probably be like, if someone was skeptical, you'd be like, screw you, I'm going to prove it to you. Or you wouldn't even care, because all that matters is finally having a way to communicate. There's so many of these issues that just fail on a kind of an Occam's razor, just like pure common sense criteria.
Someone says, I'm an SLP and my certifying organization, ASHA, also deems FC a non-substantiated method.
Yeah. And we're very grateful. I mean, it's not just ASHA. Virtually every relevant professional organization has issued a position statement against FC, including the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's virtually anyone that has professionals who are connected with severely autistic people. So the professional consensus is very robust against it.
This mom says, my son is completely nonverbal and has very profound autism and a diagnosis of severe ID. He types on his iPad like nothing I've ever seen, and has started to indirectly communicate through it. And I don't know what you mean by indirectly communicate. I've also seen lots of nonverbal people type on their iPad independently. So I can believe that's true. I don't believe there's prompting, but it would be worth looking into. Do you know of anything in Canada that would help me look into that? I don't know what she meant by indirectly communicate, though.
I don't know either, but if you're curious to, like I described earlier, you don't even need to bring in professionals to test this. As if your son, spells with multiple people, like a teacher and aide, just have one of them kind of talk about something with him while you're out of the room, and then switch, and then see if you can solicit from him information that you just don't know. But it has to be something you really are sure that that you don't know and that you can't guess based on how well you know him. You hear claims that, well, my son told me he had an earache, and it turned out he had an ear infection. So clearly he's communicating independently. But look, we all love our kids and we all know them super well. So the fact is it seems much more likely that you would pick up some kind of nonverbal signs that your child is ill. And, so that's why you have to really do this in a controlled way if you want to get the truth.
This mom says, what do you say to people like, and then she cites a TikTok doctor who says autism is a neutral source of human diversity and we don't need to diagnose it. What is the label for it then? Why use the label autistic if it's just neutral? Well, good
that's
question.
like our whole raison d'etre, how NCSA came together. I mean, we didn't have TikTok back then, but that's the neurodiversity position, right? Like autism is an identity, like homosexuality.
Neutral, right?
It's not, it's just like a difference. It could even be a gift. And, for us, I mean, I'm sure it is for some people, but the fact is this move to kind of depathologize a pathology, it just kind of, lacks internal coherence. When you look at our kids clearly have a pathology. They clearly have a medical condition. And for us, it's not just a difference. And that's why NCSA is always kind of taking on this neurodiversity pablum.
Yeah, I mean, the denial of the impaired mind, ends up, in dismantling or weakening our systems of care. For the most severely disabled. It's that important. It's that important to have the correct, honest narrative, right? Controlling and directing where policy goes. Anyway, I know it's like, oh, how long is Jill going to be asking questions? I don't know. Give me like 5 or 10 more minutes. How's that, guys? I'm in Tennessee. HCBS thinks kids can work. That will not work. They call our program. Okay, sorry, I'm not quite understanding the question. Another one. Congratulations, Amy, on your outstanding book. Are there specific advocacy actions that you and Jill suggest for 14C and guardianship issues? What are some other issues in addition to FC that you would have highlighted if you had more room in your book? Which is what we talked about at the outset.
We talked about that, but I will say that like for 14C, as I said earlier, Department of Labor has just announced they're going to do this systematic review. They call it a 14C, and they've promised to solicit public comment. Again, it didn't help in the United States Commission on Civil Rights. They got a ton of overwhelming positive comments asking to preserve 14C, and they recommended to eliminate it anyway. But I would say we will share the information when it becomes available on how to comment to preserve 14C. And so hopefully lots of people will send in their stories. We've had definitely advocacy webinars. We have a grassroots network, and I really encourage everybody to get involved in that and to kind of so that we can help guide people to advocacy on the local level.
Just FYI, someone asked, what is FC? Facilitated communication. I'm sorry, we should have been more clear. Using acronyms is always dodgy. Someone says, by the way, Texas is very restrictive on the settings rule. The larger settings mentioned are private and do not accept the waivers.
Actually, though, that's
not true. Like Marbury,
29 acres.
Brookwood, 29 acres.
Brookwood doesn't accept waivers, but 29 acres just got just is in the process of getting their final acceptance. So yeah, they've been really successful in changing the system in Texas. So if you're interested in a larger thing like that, I encourage you to check it out. That I think they've relaxed a lot of those restrictions.
Someone asks, I wonder if there's a way to find a middle ground with 14C. I'm a self-advocate who started community college before transferring to a four-year college. What if we kept 14C, but gave people the option of graduating to competitive employment if they were able? Well, that's already the policy.
That is, in fact, they really urge people it's required by law that every 6 months that you meet with 14C participants and present them with like all the reasons why they should be pursuing competitive labor. And the overwhelming majority of them, from what I can tell, do not want to. And it's not just about the job and whether or not they can do it. Another huge part of this is that people in 14C programs like being around other people who are intellectually disabled like them. And And part of the thing that's, one mom told me something that I just really stuck with me, which was that, no, my daughter does not want to be the one disabled greeter at Walmart, surrounded by a bunch of neurotypical people. She doesn't find that to be comfortable or meaningful. She likes being with her friends at her 14C program. So there's lots of reasons why participants and their families like these programs, and a lot of them have nothing to do with actual work or how much they get paid.
Yeah, but all of these adult settings, or adult programs, whether it's a day program, or whether it's an employment program, or whether it's a housing program, or whether it's a recreation program, these people often, it depends on the individuals, love being together. And
Yeah.
I'm just completely disgusted by, the people who think they know better, or the people who are so paternalistic that they feel like they have to micromanage the lives and tell them, no, you cannot spend your day with people like you, because apparently people like you are bad. Like it seems like outright obvious discrimination on the basis of disability, and also a deprivation of autonomy, right? These people are supposed to be, right? These advocates are like, we're all about autonomy, therefore you must work alone at Home Depot. Like, if you have autonomy, that means you get to choose that you want to be, in that group
Well,
setting.
honestly, I feel like one of the most offensive things about all of these debates is that the assumption that the community is a bunch of neurotypical people, and a bunch of intellectually disabled people is by definition segregated, isolated, institutional. And the best thing we can do for any person with any intellectual disability is surround them with as many neurotypical people as possible. I mean, to me, that is unbelievably offensive and ableist. And I can't believe that's articulated by people who themselves identify as disabled.
Yes, it's unbelievable to me, actually. Okay, let's go on. We're going to finish up. Texas has 13 state-supported living centers, large ICF IDD campuses. This is an entitlement, but the local IDD authorities do not inform families of this choice. Our jails are now full of persons with IDD, autism, neurocognitive disorders, TBI, etc. It has become so terrible that the Texas legislature required the Texas Commission on Jail Standards to create an IDD advisory committee to address the detention of people with IDD. We have called on the DOJ Texas it's out of compliance, but not informing families. I think that the fewer programs and the fewer placements we have for people with impaired minds, the more they are going to end up in jail. Period. End of story.
See that happening with people with psychiatric disturbance as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, now our jails here in California are mostly psychiatric wards. Yeah, because there's nowhere else to place them. Okay, this will be the last question. If people have successful stories of 14C programs that their loved ones participate in, or if they were once in a 14C program and no longer have access to it and don't have something fulfilling to take its place, please share your story with our policy coordinator, who would like to create a repository of these stories. That's not a question. That's a comment.
Leanne.
Yeah. So
let's do that. Let's absolutely collect those stories. That's fabulous. I think that's a great idea.
We are easy to reach at info@ncsautism.org. And also, frankly, like the comment section on our Facebook page, the comments on our blogs, I mean, we have an incredible wealth of real human stories and how terribly affected people are by the withering of programs and services for the severely impaired. Yet we need, I think this is what Amy is doing as such a great service to humanity, is saying like, we need to get on board with reality. We need to respect people's real competencies, their real levels of functioning, and stop engaging in these fantasies that only end up depriving them of the lifeline services they need. So a really great service to us. Amy, do you have any closing comments? And then we'll wrap it up.
No, it's just been such a privilege to talk about the book with everybody today. Thank you so much for all the great questions. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but I'm glad there's so much interest.
Absolutely. Okay. And yes, this was recorded, and I'll try to post it tomorrow or soon thereafter. Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks for staying up so late.
Night.
Okay. Good night, Amy.
Bye.